Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now, long-time listeners to the show who are familiar with my human risk mission, and if you're not, you can find out more at human-risk.com, will know that I think the way to mitigate human risk is through the deployment of behavioural science. If we can understand the real drivers of human decision-making, we can design frameworks that make it more likely people will do the things we want them to, and less likely they'll do the things we don't. Just as we need to understand coding if we want to be good at programming computers, then we need to understand behavioural science if we want to be good at influencing people. So when I speak to my clients about solving their human risk challenges, usually but not exclusively in the fields of ethics and compliance, I help them to understand how applying behavioural science to their problems can both provide insights into what isn't working and help design frameworks that are more likely to be effective. Like many rapidly growing fields, behavioural science is currently unregulated, and there hasn't historically been a professional body that directly serves the interests of both practitioners and those who buy behavioural science services, which means that there aren't any professional standards, and it's hard for people buying behavioural science consulting and training to know they're being advised by people who, put simply, know what they're talking about and are operating on an ethical basis. So I was delighted to hear about the creation of a new body called GABS, G-A-A-B-S, the Global Association of Applied Behavioural Scientists, which has been set up to meet precisely those needs. And it occurred to me that having professional bodies is a way of mitigating human risk, helping members to maintain high standards and clients to know they're in safe hands if they engage a member of that body. Which is why I thought it would be interesting to invite two of the people behind GABS onto the show. Naylor is a founding member of GABS and Nick Hobson is a board member. In our discussion, we explore the genesis of GABS and how creating a professional association helps to manage human risk in applied behavioural science. And Nick are great fun, so I think you're going to enjoy this. If you heard Nick last time he was on the show, there's a link to that in the show notes, or have listened to his Bunch of BS podcast, that's its name, not my description, you'll know that you're in for a treat. Two warnings before the show starts. Nick inadvertently gives out one terrible piece of advice, and I highlight my own idiocy when it comes to falling for a con. As the saying goes, don't try either at home. But do enjoy my conversation with Naylor and Nick Hobson on how GABS is managing human risk in applied behavioural science. And Nick, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Christian. Great to be here again.
It's my absolute pleasure to have you both. And Nick, my listeners will know you, but I'll get you to introduce yourself to them again in a second. But they may not know who you are. So can you give us a little bit of a pen portrait of yourself?
So I am or actually Araminta Naylor. But I work for a company called Influence at Work and have done so for the past few years, and initially trained did my undergrad in human sciences and did a bit of work in marketing and consumer insights and analytics, and then decided behavioural science was the route I wanted to go down, so did an MSc in social and cultural psychology, and I've ended up here.
Fantastic. And Nick?
Yes, I'm Nick, and I'm not sure what I am these days, to be honest. I think I'm an applied behavioral scientist or a social psychologist or a writer or a lecturer. But I guess my path is I was an academic, studied social psychology and neuroscience, and then sold out and went into industry, as they say, did some consulting and some product design and product build, and then eventually settled into my own brand and business, The Behaviorist, and the matching podcast, the BS podcast. And so nowadays I really sit in two groups and I head up their labs and research units to help bring evidence-based decisions for organizational and consumer solutions. And among other things here and there.
Fantastic. Well, look, lovely to have both of you here. And the reason you're here is to talk about something called GABS, G-A-A-B-S. And I wonder if you could just share with my listeners, what is GABS?
So GABS is the first sort of independent organisation that is representing the interests of applied behavioural scientists, primarily in the private sector, but we welcome everyone. And it's a group that's open to individuals and organizations, and it stands for the Global Association of Applied Behavioural Scientists.
What's the purpose of having it? Why do we need an association of behavioural scientists?
There are a number of reasons, I guess, but the first one is almost to provide a quality stamp. You wouldn't, if you had something wrong with your plumbing, I guess you wouldn't want to ask someone to help out who's maybe read a book about plumbing. You'd want someone that's trained and qualified in it. And the same if you were ill, you'd want someone who's trained as a doctor or a nurse. So I guess it has the same kind of principle in that we want to have a quality stamp for behavioural scientists. And alongside that, there's the sort of ethical application of it as well. And having a great community of behavioural scientists, I guess, altogether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if I'll jump in there, this is what's going to probably be how this is going to go, is that Addie's going to give you really great answers, and then I'm going to go on some winding rant. So insert my first winding right here.
Be my guest. That's why we have both of you on, to have the factual, straightforward answers, and then the sort of flights of fancy to help us think a bit more about it.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. So I find it interesting, right? Like the progression of the field over the last 10, 20 years. It's almost a double-edged sword, where it's a good thing that we've gotten this traction, that we've gotten the attention, that people are sort of leaving their jobs in marketing or product or insurance or compliance or whatever it is, to be like, holy shit, I love this behavioral science stuff. I want to do a career in it. Or, which is you guys, or the other party, which is me, I'm leaving academia to, quote unquote, do science in the real world. Like, that's on paper, on the surface, that is a great thing, and it has contributed to, as I said, the progression and the growth of applied behavioral science, and I think it will continue to do so. But it comes with a bit of an unintended consequence, which is a possible dilution of the field of anyone and everyone calling themselves a behavioral scientist. Now, we're not the type of field, we're not the type of people to be elitist or, to exclude individuals. I think more the merrier. And yet we still need some sort of structure in place, some sort of organization to ensure, like Addie said, that we are doing behavioral science justice, and we're doing it in a good way.
So how did this come about?
I first heard about it when I joined Influence Work, the company I'm working at, and there'd been a conversation with a group of people who'd done the behavioural science exec program at LSE about this sort of need for it. And from there, I think it grew to people in different areas, not just people from LSE, all thinking, actually, this is a great idea. How can we move it forward? And so the conversation's just begun, and we've been working on it for, I probably would say, the past 18 months, maybe. And then Nick joined. How long ago did you join in, Nick?
I came when all the hard work was done, and I said, hey, guys, this seems like a really cool thing. Can I be involved? About 6 months, maybe 6 or 8 months ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been in the pipeline for a while.
Yeah, I mean, you joke about that, Nick, but I think this is really interesting, because this is a great example of a bunch of people getting together and just going, it's almost as if the discipline's sort of grown up a bit. There's a ton of people doing these things, and it's become a thing, and people have heard the term, and there's lots of people doing it, but there isn't a body that pulls this thing together. And so there's a group of people that sort of go, well, we should try and, without sort of trying to overly regulate or set rules, but let's pull some people together. Let's have a structure around this so that everybody knows what this is about. We can share knowledge, share information. And it struck me, it's kind of going back, if you go back way back when, sort of medieval guilds would be a good example of sort of getting tradespeople together to try and combine knowledge, work together and build something. And I think it's really interesting and exciting to have something like that evolving in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I also think it's just like a natural thing that humans do as social creatures and a social species, that we have this thing, a trade, a religion, a belief, or in this case, a field that sort of centers around certain core premises around behavioral science or psychology. And then it becomes more of a thing, and it's sort of this add-on effect. And before long, you see if it's actually doing well for whatever number of reasons or factors that are involved, that the people who are involved sit back and say, okay, well, how can we ensure that what this thing is, whether it's a religion again or a field, how do we ensure that its growth is going to be sustainable and is going to service the people who are involved? So in our case, the professionals, the practitioners, and by extension, the clients we serve. So I think psychologically, it is a very natural thing for something like this to emerge. And maybe it's just our craving and deep desire for social structure and social organization. Yeah, because without it, it would be sort of chaotic and willy-nilly and all over the place. And we know we don't really like that. It's sort of a very aversive feeling for us not to have structure and organization. So I think that partly explains the natural emergence of GABS and why now as well.
So it's a gathering of there's some academics on the board. There are practitioners there across the globe with a range of different disciplines. What's the how are we sort of seeing this thing grow, and what sort of people have you got coming in and joining it, Atty?
Well, we've got a huge number of people on the board, as you said. We've got the likes of Daniel Kahneman, Robert Cialdini. We've got Maya Shankar from Google. So some great people there. And also we've got a lovely group of directors. So head of code of conduct is Liam Delaney. We've got Steve Martin as our chairman. But ultimately, in terms of how we're going to grow, we're really thinking about our members and what they want and what they think is best for the community of behavioural scientists that is going to be there, that network. And so we've had a few ideas, but actually, realistically, we're going to think about how it's going to work for them and ask for their opinions too.
And I love that. I mean, you rattle off that list, right? This is genuinely amazing stuff. If you were trying to pick some big hitters in the space, people that have really done some great, it doesn't get much bigger than a Nobel Prize winner. And there's one of those, and a ton of other people who've written some great stuff, done some great practice. So this really is the greatest hits of behavioral science people. And if you were looking, you go to a bookstore or you go onto YouTube to look for some videos, these are big names there that are backing this thing. And then what you've got underpinning that is a bunch of practitioners, myself included, that are part of this broader organization. So it's really looking both at people that have really pioneered the theory of the thing, that have done the kind of scientific legwork. And then you've got this horde of practical people with a range of different applications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's so cool to see, for instance, like you said, the academic theoretical groundwork laid by the likes of Kahneman with prospect theory in the 70s and 80s, and Cialdini's work in the 80s and 90s on influence and persuasion. And then 20, 30 years later, this is happening. And I can only imagine if I were Danny or Bob sitting back, I would be thrilled that an organization like this is being set up. Hence their involvement, because they've done so much good. So they've done so much work in laying that groundwork that it would just be such a shame for it for all that knowledge and all that insight to go to waste. And so I think that's why it's really important that the likes of them are involved. And it suggests for me, which is becoming more of an obsession, this translational piece of science where science meets practice. And what does it mean for us to gain and acquire knowledge and to share knowledge from the academy side and by doing basic research, but then also sharing it and acquiring it and moving it around through some sort of knowledge transfer process down to the people, on the ground, for those who are working for private companies and industry and government and policy. How does that work? What does it look like? How do you safeguard that? Because as we know, especially in for-profit private sectors and specific industries or business functions, there's a lot of bullshit out there. There's a lot of charlatans and there's a lot of snake oil salesmen and women going around peddling this and that solution or this and that product. And so now is the time, it seems, that there is an interest from the market to have evidence, to have, I don't use this word because scientists don't use the word proof, but to have some proof that what they're doing, what they're selling, what they're bringing to market works. And carries its weight in water. So,
and implicit in setting this up is you've said, okay, so what we'll do here is we will open up this association. We will have standards that people need to adhere to become members, and that's then the way of ensuring that actually, if you have the badge, to use a simple term, membership. You've passed a certain test and you are adhering to a set of standards. Can you give us a sense, how are those things being thought about? How are we thinking about sort of people's qualifications and how we think about the standards that they need to adhere to?
So in terms of the qualifications, well, we have as I said, we have the two types of membership. We have the individual and the organizational. To be an organizational member, you can either be a behavioral science consultancy in itself, or you can be sort of a team within a large company. But the main idea is that you have proof of a portfolio of applied behavioural science projects, but that also you have 2/3 of your team members would qualify to be individual members themselves. So it's proof that that team is made up of people who have the qualifications to meet individual membership criteria. And then in terms of being an individual member, we've got we want people to have either a master's degree or a PhD in a relevant behavioral science subject. So that might be psychology, decision science, neuroscience, behavioral economics, behavioral science, all those things. And if not, then they can kind of meet two other types of criteria. So that might be having publications in peer-reviewed journals, having proof of relevant contribution to the field. Maybe they have a teaching position on a behavioral science program. They might have completed a training program, like, for example, the executive program in behavioral science at Columbia University. So there are a number of ways. What we've tried to do is capture people who have the training and the qualifications through sort of university and the sort of MSc, PhD side, but also those people who've put years' work into behavioral science and applied behavioral science in the field. We want to be as inclusive as possible, but with the relevant qualifications, if that's the right word to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's so important, Adi, like the inclusivity aspect of GABS. I think there could have been, and maybe there are groups out there that are similar to us who wanted to really like maintain the stuffiness of academia. And I say that as a former academic, because that is there, that exists. There is this sort of superiority bias that a lot of academics hold. It's like, well, I have a PhD and therefore I know more, or I'm smarter than you. That's not true. You guys know this as well, that there's plenty of good behavioral science practitioners out there who don't have a PhD or even a master's, and instead their classroom, if you will, or their laboratory is the real world of boardrooms and workrooms and classrooms and cafeterias, the real world. And so that was that was before I came around and parachuted in front of the GABS train. But I was glad to hear that they actually...
Listeners, don't parachute in front of a train under any circumstances. It's a terrible bit of advice.
I think I mixed up my idioms there. Yeah. Maybe parachuted in front of something a little bit nicer than a train. Is that there are multiple paths, multiple routes to doing a behavioral science and to being a behavioral scientist, academia only being one of them. And so we at GABS really tried to ensure that the eligibility criteria captured that sufficiently.
I think that's really interesting around this, because if I look at the space that I know well, I came into this because I went, there's a problem here in terms of the way compliance is operating on the ground. And I sort of was looking for a solution to it. And, that's not something I think that somebody would naturally, who was starting behavioral science, there are obvious applications for it, marketing being a really good example, where you would start to say that's sort of, and I think what's nice about those fusions is that you bring use cases that might never have occurred to people into play. And that for me is one of the powerful pieces, because when we look at, where people often go, where can you apply this thing? And I think it's really, if you compare it to another discipline that I have a qualification in, which is accounting, if I compare that, where is accounting relevant? There are plenty of situations where it is, but there are plenty of situations where it's probably less relevant, whereas behavioral science has a much broader application. And so I like this fact that actually what we're doing is here, we say, it's back to your point around inclusivity, is actually that's how we capture that, because there is a fascinating thing that sort of says, actually, behavioral science isn't something that we necessarily switch on. It's happening all the time. It's just that there are some people deploying it without realizing it, some really well, some not so well. And I like this idea that it's combining the real world stuff of sort of applications that one wouldn't naturally think of that are using beautifully the human ingenuity. But then there's also the obvious theoretical stuff, the stuff that's been done in the lab. And bringing those two things together, I think, is a really powerful combination.
And what if we do all of this right, what if we were to capture the attention and the interest of executives at a Fortune 100 company, right? At a Microsoft or at Amazon, and that's sort of happening actually, where we're seeing what is the role of the CBO, the Chief Behavioral Officer, so that we have more of these internal champions that are in these big organizations and these big companies to do the bidding of behavioral science, for us and for this nascent and growing field. And I think, GABS and similar other initiatives will help do that, just sort of get us in front of the right people at the right time. So there's that. And also on the ethics and compliance side, which we can get to, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting implications there with that you've thought of, Christian. We the marketplace and the workplace needs a GABS and needs behavioral science, the safeguarding of behavioral science for the end user, for the employee, to ensure that the employees, rights are being looked after, to ensure that the user and the consumer and the donor, that audience member is being looked after through applications of behavioral science. Because as we've seen in the last 5-10 years, especially with big tech, if you don't think about how to protect the interests of the end user, then we can actually grossly misuse and misapply behavioral science and psychology, for short-term shareholder gain instead of an actual benefit to the individual, whomever they are.
Clearly, because this is banging my space, but I think that ethical piece is really interesting, because if you look at where the discipline has come from in terms of academia and things like nudging, there is a strong sense that we recognize. I mean, it's almost, sort of, to be slightly facetious, it's almost sort of like if you look at sort of Harry Potter magic skills, you can use them for good or you can use them for bad. And I think there's something really, really interesting about making sure that we put that at the forefront of it, because if that doesn't happen, you end up with this PR image of it's all about manipulating people and influencing them. And of course it can be, if that's how you choose to deploy it, but actually it can do some tremendous good. And therefore having a strong ethical sense around, what are we trying to do with this? How do we make sure that we are acting in people's best interest? Not just what we think is in their best interest, but actually giving them an opportunity. All of this stuff really important, difficult and challenging at times, but really, really important. And, one of the reasons I was very keen to sign up is clear that is at the core of this piece. So there is very, very clearly documented sense that we want to do this the right way, and that part of the reason for setting the structure up is to kind of ensure that there's a strong statement out there about what we want to use this for and the sorts of use cases that possibly we don't.
Well, I'm just thinking that when you were saying that, I guess the terminology can come across in a negative way sometimes, and actually we come across that quite a lot. So our speciality, I guess, or specialism is influence and persuasion. And I've been doing some work with a wealth manager at the moment, and it started about a year ago, but initially all they would say is you can't use the word persuade. It has really negative connotations in our company. And that, I guess, brings it all back to this idea of ethics, that this persuasion is the word we use because that is the technical term for the principles of persuasion. That's what they are. But the way in which we use them is what's really important. And having those conversations around ethics are key to all the work we do in behavioural science. And that is something definitely that GABS is really trying to support. It's that sort of honesty, openness, ensuring that there are going to be no sort of negative outcomes, or at least looking to see if you think there may be this concept of sort of spillover effects that some people might not know about if they haven't done some of the training, I guess. So all those different things that you want to ensure people think about and have a conversation about, and the guidelines that will help support that. I think that's what GABS is all about.
And I love that word, your comment around the word persuasion, because it always makes me think of the area I work in, compliance, right? I always talk about this and sort of say, if you were trying to pick a brand name that was hideous, awful, and sort of, transmitted precisely the wrong signals to the target audience, you would come up with compliance. And then you'd add the suffix officer to it just to make it really unpleasant. In fact, it's the only time I can think of where adding the word officer actually makes something worse. But you look at it, you just go, there's a really good example. Language really matters, and how we talk about these things really matters. And I think that's why I think it's really important. Behavioral science has gone through an interesting piece in relation to COVID, for example, where particularly in the UK, there was a lot of negativity around, to start with, a lot of government policy seemed to be being driven by behavioural, and wasn't necessarily the case. But there was this sort of, it got a very bad rub. And I think it's really important that we recognise that, and I always use the facetious example of a car, and I sort of go, you can use a car for really bad things, right? You can use it to get away from bank robbery, to run people over, to cause all sorts of mayhem. Equally, you can use it to drive people to hospital, to deliver food and medicines. So there's a positive side. And I kind of look at behavioural science a little bit in the same way, that there are absolutely terrible things you could try to do with it, manipulative, awful things. But equally, there's some amazing, empowering things. And so having this body that is there to steer that in the right direction, to make sure that if there are those negative uses, one, you couldn't claim you didn't know, because we're really highlighting what's a good use of this stuff and what's good practice and how can we learn from other people. And therefore, if people are using it, that's not through, you can't really claim you didn't know. And hopefully, I think part of the reason for having the association of people is to sort of build those things and to say, if we want to make sure this function and this ideas and these concepts are used properly, that we set a standard. And we set and that's not to say we have, because we understand behavior, you can't have a standardized, so you must do this in this circumstance, but a set of guiding principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think what we'd like to see as well is the fact that we have the individual members, and they may be part of an organizational member or they may not be, but we want those individuals in their own organizations to be having those conversations with those organizations. So it's kind of spreading that need for ethics, for talking about what's right and wrong. It's not just that individual member, but they're bringing it back to wherever they are working. And I think that's also a really important part of this as well.
And the only thing I think that's bang on, the other thing I'd add is for any prospects or potential buyers of behavioral science services, is how do they know where, and this is because we're such a sort of new field, how does the buyer know where to go to find us and to find the ones of us who are doing ethically sound work and doing it right? And we envision that GABS could be that platform or that place, that meeting place where the practitioners, the sellers of the services, but also the buyers could come to see, okay, who are the ones who have the GABS certification, and so I feel more confident as a buyer in this space to get the right work and the right people to do the job. So we envision that for GABS as well.
That's fascinating, because you sort of go, well, how would I set about otherwise knowing whether I've got somebody who's it's a fascinating question. The sort of, it's how do we do that normally? We rely on bodies, and there is a sort of structure in place for these things. And so I think it's really interesting when something builds up to a scale, and suddenly actually, lots of people are becoming aware of behavioral science. They're reading about it, books, they're hearing about it, and that might be useful. Where do I start with this thing? I mean, it's a real problem, because we clearly say to people, you can't just read the books and think there's a danger in doing it. The lovely thing about it is it is very accessible. So there are some things that you can start to do, but it's not as simple as all that. And so that then begs the question, well, where do I go? And I think this is it's almost the behavioral science community looking and going, okay, actually, we need to think about this from the perspective of the end user, which is something we're very good at, right? We look at what our target audience think. And you've rightly identified a thing that goes, well, how do I know? I think it's a lovely example of us putting into practice the things that we do in our day job in terms of thinking about how people approach us.
And this is coming also at the right time where, because it's not just behavioral science that exists in a vacuum, as we know, like we are leaning on a lot of other disciplines and fields and areas of specialization and expertise. And so there's a lot of conversation around like things like management science, human-centric design, or just design thinking overall. Like a lot of these disciplines just pair so well with behavioral science. Above all, this notion that we need to treat people well. We need to think about employees. We need to think about our consumers and customers. And I think now is like big tech is at its moment of reckoning, right? And so I think behavioral science sort of just fits in really well right there, because we have to be so careful with the ethical piece, as we've been saying over the last few minutes, that behavioral science can be used for good and for bad. And I should say, I want to circle back that on this point, it's not like the principles of psychology and behavioral science kind of just got switched on 10 years ago once these books came out. Like people have been applying these behavioral science and psychology principles for as long as humans have been humans, and often for for bad. And when you look at it within the world of work or even in policy, the non-scientist who doesn't have a training still has a lay understanding, still has a folk psychology, as we call it, of what it takes to convince or to persuade or to manipulate or to get what he or she wants. Like, that's just what it means to be humans. And there's individual differences in there too. Some people are really good at it, at persuading and convincing. And if they don't have any sort of checks and balances, then they're going to do it in a nefarious, bad, evil way. And so we just have to remind ourselves of that, is that our science isn't reserved to just us as the behavioral scientists or the behavioral practitioners. Anyone can do this kind of stuff because it's not rocket science, right? It's just behavioral science.
You've reminded me actually of a story which I keep meaning to tell people around in Istanbul, and this isn't reflective of the series as a whole. I got scammed a couple of years ago, and it's still, you just literally reminded me of this classic thing they do. Shoe shine person is walking away and they drop a brush, and you then helpfully go pick the brush up, and they then polish your shoes as a sort of way of saying thank you. And then you feel the need to reciprocate and give them some money. So in essence, they've just literally legged you over. And it happened to me, and it was terrible because I was wearing a pair of training shoes, which generally don't lend themselves particularly to being polished. Yeah. And the guy literally gets this brush that I've handed back to him and polishes it. And as it's happening, I'm recognizing this is not normal. And I know, and I'm handing them over, and it's happened with it. I think it was in the first few hours of being in the city. And I'm fuming about this. And if ever I wanted an example of, and I read it online, it's a common scam, right? So I don't feel totally stupid. But I see them going, that is behavioral science in action. It's precisely the kind of thing I don't want. So he is not getting membership of this association, that's for sure. But I think it's a really con artistry. I love that story because it illustrates two things. One is, it doesn't matter how much you know about behavioral science, you can still get left over by people doing bad things, right? We still fall for this stuff. But the second thing is, it really illustrates your point around, these tricks have been around for some time. And so almost what we're doing now is it's a codification of that stuff. And coming with that, if we're going to add some sophistication to that and some language to that, we need some rules and thinking around it. And it needs to be a grown-up piece rather than just something that's done casually by con artist shoe shine people who are to be avoided at all costs.
Addy, any shoe shine applicants? We gotta flag those ones.
Haven't seen any yet.
I didn't take his name, unfortunately. Not that I suspect he would have been honest with me had I asked for it.
Yeah, right.
It does remind me of something though, because I was doing a report as a sort of related to finance reports at the start of COVID, and looking at sort of what the implications might be for consumers in terms of finances. And actually one of the big things that really happened as a result was increasing number of scams. And I think it's taking advantage of that sort of cognitive overload. And people can tell when this is happening, and they go for it. The scammers go for it, and that's because they do have that insight into the sort of what humans are going to do wrong. We make those mistakes. So it's really interesting to see it in that context.
And so, just to keep going on this, because I think it's really interesting. They like we said, right? People have been doing this for millennia, yeah, as long as humans have been humans. And even like 10, 15 years ago, when sort of like digital revolution 2.0 and Internet of Things and smart technology and all these things, like all of these products and services, why are they so good? They're so good because they nudge us, right? To use that term deliberately, they nudge us in a particular direction, usually in the direction to use that product or that service more, to make for the company and organization to make more money, the business to make more money. It makes sense, right? And we had concerns. Some of us had some concerns about that, but really we didn't make a huge stink about it. Like, they're so part of our, like, this technology is so part of our life now that we wouldn't dare say it's such a terrible thing, and how dare these companies do this to us. But then we come around and say, hey, we're behavioral scientists and we're really good at understanding and changing behavior. And all of a sudden it's like, you guys are evil, it's going to be done for bad. Because there's like a name for it, because it's behavioral science, because it's behavioral economics, because it's nudging. Whereas before there wasn't really a name. It was just people still doing it. But now, because we are the experts and we are the really ones who kind of, mischievously know what buttons to press on an individual, So it's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing because we have to be careful with that power we hold, and all the more reason, I think, for us to be concerned and to be thinking about the ethics of behavioral science application.
And it is interesting when you talk about that, and I sort of loosely think about behavioral science in the wild, and this stuff is going on all around us. Technology, I think, is a really good example of a leveraged model of that, where, historically interventions would be in sort of, either in a one-on-one situation in a small group of people, or maybe if you start to think about traditional advertising, you could maybe broadcast to a larger audience. But actually now with technology, it's really pinpoint accuracy, very, very sophisticated. And that's taking, I think, the need, as you say, the need to think about how this is working on a whole new level, because you would sort of go, what damage can people do if they abuse this? And sure, we've got, maybe big cults would be an example of things where historically where there'd been poor manipulation, but now it's pervasive. So I think you're right. It's a really interesting time to look at it and say, actually, technology hastens the need for us to think really carefully about these topics and recognize. And I think it's also, part of the benefit of having an association and kind of pushing the idea of behavioral science out there and giving people a focal point to find out for more information about it is really to say, actually, you might have been able to, to your point, Atty, you might have been able to immunize yourself in the past, but the cognitive overload that we all have, our dependence on technological platforms, particularly when, a lot of us are working from home now as well. I was thinking the other day, most of my information comes through a screen.
Yeah.
And that might be information I'm gathering from people I trust, one-on-one conversations. It might be, even if I'm watching sports, I'm doing it through a screen. If I'm watching news, I'm getting it through. So there's all of this stuff coming through. So it's particularly prevalent now. And I think just raising the public's awareness of this piece, because if you turn around to people and go, don't be conned, nobody likes to think of themselves as an idiot. So if we sort of go around and go, don't be fooled by it, nobody's going to sit there and go, that somehow they think they're susceptible to it, and yet we all are. And I think there is, to your point, there's something really interesting about the environment that we're in now, where we're getting information from, and making people aware of behavioral science and making it seem like accessible gives us an opportunity to get some of these basic concepts across. So I think turning around to people and saying, don't be fooled by scamming politicians or dark arts, that's a really difficult conversation to have. But maybe if we can maybe we can get critical thinking into people's minds by using this badge and making that accessible rather than pointing out how silly they're being or the potential risks that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing this sort of trend in the field where I think they call it like self-nudging. So it's applying and using the insights of personality.
Sounds very naughty, but hey.
Yeah. So self-nudging to improve one's own life. So it's not necessarily that you're being nudged by an institution or organization or an employer, but instead you are kind of tricking yourself, or a personal hack, if you will, to design your life and your own environment to instill the right habits for yourself so that you can make the right decisions. And when I hear those things, it's great, because I think we need that, and it takes us above. It elevates us above the self-help bookshelf, that we see, which continues to grow year over year in sales, because it puts it into the sphere of science and sort of like evidence-based self-nudging. And back to your point, Christian, like the only way that we're going to do that well is if those experts who are, maybe they're coaches, maybe they're personal consultants working with individuals, maybe they're writing books, creating podcasts, designing apps. I think that's the big space where we're seeing this stuff. If they're GAB certified, then we know that they're going to be delivering these types of products and services in a way that's going to, benefit that end user who's going to be designing a life for themselves that's good, that's sustainable. So there is this idea, or this notion of giving. I have a project with some students of mine called GPA, Give Psychology Away, to give those insights away to the people who need it most, which is everyday people, the public.
I love that idea, because I do think one of the failings nowadays is we haven't been teaching people critical thinking, and so we've kind of grown up with it. Many people haven't had an education where they've been encouraged to challenge. It's almost been sort of, you are a consumer, And I'll go into my usual rant about the education system and sort of looks at things on a very linear basis. So we have physics and we have chemistry and we have history and geography, like those things operate separately. And actually, the real world doesn't work on that. But, it's not like here's a moment where physics is relevant and here's a moment where history is relevant. It's kind of like all of those things together. And I think that's one of the challenges here, is that lots of people are just sort of not taught in a way that helps them navigate that. If you add that lens of psychology and behavioral science around and say, actually, a bit like cooking, it's good to know how you can cook food for yourself as opposed to having to buy unhealthy meals and more expensive meals and being in control of your diet. I think actually being in control of the information that's coming into your brain and what might be wrong and flawed with that information is incredibly powerful and valuable it's always been valuable. It's particularly valuable now. And I love that idea of giving that away to people. So it's not a secret source, a secret formula that we cling on to, but actually that we help people with this stuff. And therefore, I think that also has the benefit of forcing us to up our game. Because actually if you sit there and say, I've got some secret knowledge that I'm going to deploy, there's a risk that you just go, well, I don't have to try too hard. And I think we should be testing ourselves out by actually giving people an awareness of some of these techniques so they can be thinking challenging. Because that means we have to try that a little bit harder.
I think there's another side to that as well. I think one of the things that we were discussing the other day was actually the importance of telling people what doesn't work. And that's something that everyone knows is or has been an issue in the field of psychology in particular, but actually having that knowledge of not just showing off what goes right, but what goes wrong, trying to work out why it doesn't work and being able to sort of explain to people or help them understand why that's the case, that can be just as important, I think.
That's really interesting. So I had a previous guest on the show who's created something called the Journal of Trial and Error. And the idea here basically is that things in the academic world, stuff that gets published is stuff that's successful, right? So you can write about it, right? Nobody wants to write about failure. And the basic principle behind this thing was, let's hear about the stuff that you screwed up, that didn't work out, the stuff that no other academic publication would normally touch. They'll put there, and it's everything from sort of, flawed hypotheses through to badly executed experiments. Really interesting stuff. And I love this because I think there's this pervasive narrative of, somehow every geniuses get things right and anybody that makes a mistake is an idiot. And clearly, the words trial and error illustrate that we need to make mistakes to move on. And some of the most amazing inventions have come out of, frankly, screw-ups and mistakes. And I love that idea because I think there's a nice one. It's humble. It's the way we should be. But secondly, we all know intuitively that we all screw stuff up. And it would be a much healthier society if we could just admit to that a bit more often, rather than having this narrative of sort of that makes you a loser or an idiot, because it doesn't. We all do it. And I love that. I love the normalization of making mistakes. I think would be a great thing.
I think you can learn far more from a mistake than you can from something good that goes right as well.
Yeah, it's a basic premise of science, like science at its core, right? But two things. One, yeah, like Addy, like you said, it's just as relevant and important for a person to know what will work to, let's say, for example, improve their habits, just as much as what won't work for them to improve. Like that's if not probably more important to, like you said, Addy, to know what doesn't work for them. Yeah. And the second thing I'll add to this piece is around some of the practices within academia. Like we know over the last 10 years, there's been this replicability or replication crisis. So there are some things that I think we should borrow from academia, like basic research, psychology, and behavioral science. And there are some things that we should definitely not borrow. And one of the things we should definitely not borrow is the incentive structures which promoted only positive results and neglected or overlooked negative or null results, which led to this file drawer effect, which led to a replication crisis because their currency is positive publications. That's what they trade in. That's how they get their jobs. That's how they get their scholarships. That's how they get their grants. That's how they get their tenure. And so if we take those lessons, now that we are doing science in the wild, in industry and in policy, we have to step back and ask ourselves, what are the bigger incentives that are at play here, which may be forcing our hand to present data in a certain way or to do one research, to engage in one research question over another. And that is really important within industry and when you're talking about money and budgets and trying to convince stakeholders that your idea is better because you're going to get the right answer for them that's going to make them look good or, increase their bottom line or whatever it may be, right? So if we're not careful, and this goes for GABS and just the broader field and community at large, then we could lose grip of doing our science right. And we could end up in the same place as the academics did 5-10 years ago. So something that we have to be careful, and all the more reason to have a group like GABS.
And this goes back to that, I guess, honesty aspect that we were talking about in terms of the ethics. Is the number of times I've had conversations with clients, and as you said, Nick, they've said, okay, what does this mean for, what is this going to bring in terms of value at the end of it? And it's that honesty of saying, this is the evidence we have in terms of the research. This is what we might expect, but actually it could go in any direction because this is behavioral science. We've kind of got to see how it applies to your specific context. And I think that's definitely a very important part of it, is that honesty up front of saying, okay, this is your end goal. This is how we'll think about getting there. This is what we expect will happen. But we've got to see where it goes.
It's a hypothesis.
Yeah.
It is fascinating though, isn't it? Because you sort of, one of the interesting conversations you have with people is you go, okay, so you understand behavioral science. And that start point makes me nervous because you kind of go, I think I know where this is going. So what should we do here? Now, sometimes you can look at it and go, oh my God, what you're doing is so, negative social proof is my favorite example.
Yeah, mine too.
If you can spot that a mile off and you kind of go, okay, pretty likely that's not going to be helpful. Ditto, if you've chucked a ton of friction into a process and you're wondering why people aren't doing what you want them to do, there's a clue there. And so there's some examples, I think, where you've got extremities where you would kind of go, okay, here, no need necessarily to do any great amount of experimentation. We can probably with certainty say that is likely to be contributing to that thing. So classic example for people, passwords, right? Make password requirements ludicrous. High likelihood people will forget them. Next logical step is they may write it down on a Post-it note and you may have a security issue, right? Simple things. But many situations don't present themselves that simply. And then we need to get into these stages of experimenting. And I think it's really interesting that there are plenty of those simple examples, but there's plenty more examples where there's a whole load more complexity and we do need to experiment. And I think it's fascinating that there's a little bit of a danger that this discipline has presented itself at either end of the spectrum. Everything is simply solvable with a silver bullet, or, well, we have no clue and we need to experiment here because how do you expect us to have an answer to that? Both of those things, and it's meshing those two things together that says there are going to be times where we really do need to experiment with these things. And there's going to be some times where possibly we might have a pretty damn good idea based on past experience as to what's going wrong.
And there's a lot in between those two things too, right? Like when you look at, so it's like the question of how do you do science or how do you do behavioral science? The paragon of that is experimentation or treatments, randomized control trials, where you have a experimental condition, a control condition, et cetera, et cetera. That is sort of, but that's only one version of science. There's other ways to do science, both quantitative and qualitative. And so, but you're right, Christian. You see these sort of two extremes out there. You see those who are fairly dogmatic and say, you're not doing behavioral science unless you're doing a randomized control trial. I don't think that's true. And then there's the other extreme, which is like, I'm just going to throw a bunch of heuristics at you and let's see which one is most relevant or interesting to you. And that's your solution. Also not useful. I think there's a huge range and we need to sort of tap into every single one along the way, depending on what the problem is for the client or for the end user. And that may be to start like a qualitative focus group, right? And then from those learnings, maybe the next step is to just do some survey data, just to gather some data. And of course, because we're looking at many variables, that's just going to be correlation, and correlation doesn't mean causation. And if the problem is so hairy that it requires the next step, which is to determine causality and cause and effect, well, then let's go and run an experiment and control for some extraneous variables, et cetera, et cetera. There's a need for everything. There's a need for all of those at every point, depending on what the problem is, as I said. And so we just have to remember that we have a lot of leeway. We can sort of play in that space and still go to sleep at night, call ourselves scientists. Well, that's what I tell myself. I'm projecting now.
But I love that because I think it's nice in a way because it reflects the brutal honesty of and the complexities of life. and the way we are. And, I think, what we're going through at the moment is really interesting because we've seen many of us had very organized, like things were controlled and we had all sorts of ability. And then all of a sudden, particularly those of us living in the kind of the Western world, suddenly COVID has thrown up a whole load of presumptions that we had made about the way we would run our lives and things are based on have been thrown upside down. And I'm a rough guess here, all of the people on this are relatively comfortable, not suffering in the way many people are. So we're sort of, what you might loosely term first world problems. But nonetheless, it's been a really interesting, and I think it's been highly illustrative. And therefore, back to your point, Nick, this is an interesting time to be reflecting on this, sort of recognizing that actually the world is complicated, challenging, and difficult. And we need to have a nuanced approach to that, guided by some overall principles, but at least be thinking around we're not coming here with standardized solutions to things because the world isn't standardized.
That's right. I agree. The world is complex and nuanced, and as we know from the field, context is king, or context is everything. Whatever the one-liner tagline is, and that couldn't be truer in the current climate with COVID. And I do think that people are coming around to that idea, where if you're in a boardroom, with a potential buyer and a potential client, and you have to sell them on the idea of doing science, and that, you say, look, it's going to take you a little bit longer. It's going to cost you a little bit more money. And I can't guarantee you that it's going to work. I can't guarantee you're going to see your returns. 5-10 years ago, they would have said, get the fuck out of my office, or laugh you out of the office. Now, at least they'll go, okay, tell me more. And that's a positive sign for us, I think. Small wins.
Form of progress. I love it. Right. Look, so to close us out, and once again, thank you for both of you for coming on the podcast. Let's just look at things because we like, as behavioral scientists, to look at things from the perspective of the individuals involved in it. So just give us the perspective of, if somebody is working in behavioral science, why would they want to? Remind us why they'd want to join GABS and how they would go about doing it, and then we'll have the flip side of, if somebody's looking to hire a behavioral scientist, what process would they go through to identify somebody that could help them, that was accredited by GABS? So
to apply, you can go to www.gabs.com or .org, actually. I should have known that. GAABS.org. And there's a little tab that says members, and there it will remind you of the membership criteria, and you can apply through there. And you just have to have things at the ready, like master's certificates or proof of your work, things like that. And benefits, I just think it's going to be such a great community of behavioral scientists, and the fact that we have people who are really experienced in their field, who are willing to learn from other people who are from all over the world, I think is just a fantastic place to be.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that, we're, what is it now? I think totaling around 30 countries, including Colombia, Germany, Singapore, Ireland, UK, Australia, Greece, Guatemala, Italy, Germany, Brazil, Argentina, so on and so on. Canada, of course. I can't forget that one. So it truly, what I like to say about GABS is we like to put the G first in GABS. It really, truly is global. And we're seeing that by our early registrations, and now with our official members and applicants. And we're seeing dozens of applications come in every day, which is really exciting. And for us, the last thing I'll say is just stay tuned for the year 2021. We are planning some fun activities and initiatives, a series of events, and maybe some other things that GABS will put on and put together for our members, and to just draw attention to the fact that we're here and we're pulling this great community of behavioral practitioners together. So go to GABS.org, like Ati said, and if anyone is interested, they can come send us a note, and we're always willing to have a conversation.
Amazing. So that was from the side of the person wanting to join. Let's have a look at it from the side of somebody that goes, I love this behavioral science stuff, don't know much about it myself. I need an expert to help me. How do I approach that topic using the benefit of GABS memberships?
So eventually on the site, we will have like a dedicated page of resources where possible clients or buyers can go and say, well, to learn a little bit more about what behavioral science is, but also to be put in touch with the right service provider of who's doing, say, a behavioral science consulting. So that's going to come time TBD, but eventually it'll be on the site for potential clients. And then also, but in the meantime, you can see who on, say, LinkedIn has their GABS membership. So you can see which organizations or which individual members, if they're just an individual or if they run like a boutique shop, then you can see whether or not they are a certified GABS member. And so that should give the person or the group a little bit more confidence that they belong to this organization.
Fantastic nudge for me to remind me that I need to update mine. So I will do that before this episode goes out. Otherwise, it'd be a bit weird. And both of you, I'm sure, will already have done it. But look, thank you so much, one, for the work that you've put in behind the scenes, because as ever, as we say with conferences, events, parties, and anything else, these things don't just happen. And I think it's a tremendous amount of work by both of you and a ton of other people to bring this thing together. So I, for one, on behalf of the behavioral science community, extremely grateful. Thank you for that. But thank you also for coming onto the podcast and providing some fascinating insights.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Christian. Always fun.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Atty and Nick for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Atty and Nick and the work that they do, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those there. If you're interested in finding out more about GABS, you'll find a link to the GABS website there as well, and a link to Nick's Just a Bunch of BS podcast, which is highly recommended listening. If you're new to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show and haven't yet left a 5-star review, please do on whichever platform you're using. It really does help. To find out more about the work that I do with clients in applied behavioural science, visit human-risk.com. And as you'll have gathered from the episode, I am a member of GABS, so you're in safe hands. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this podcast, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.